Hi, I'm Lynn Wise, and with me today is Reva Bhalla. Today we're going to be talking about the next steps after the implementation of the Iran deal. So Reva, there's been a lot happening. We have had on Saturday the lifting of sanctions. We had a negotiation of a prisoner swap, and then on Sunday we had the implementation of more sanctions related to a different deal. Can you kind of explain how all of these things are separate but also interconnected?
Yeah, well, the series of events here is essentially we've been working up toward the implementation of the deal to have the major sanctions lifting that Iran has been waiting for. Naturally, the U.S. administration wanted to link the prisoner swap to the nuclear deal, even though they denied that earlier. They didn't want to raise expectations, but that was apparently, from all the leaks that came out afterward, a very big component of this negotiation up to the very last second. Now, as we saw everything come through on the implementation of the nuclear deal as planned, with the bonus of the prisoner swap coming through, we also saw, as you said, the imposition of additional sanctions on Iran. And that's related to the recent missile test Iran did at the beginning of the year. And essentially that's related to Iran's ballistic missile program. And what's interesting here is that, as we're moving forward with the implementation of this deal, it raises the question of how the two sides are going to interpret the deal. And from Iran's point of view, they drew the red line at the ballistic missile program, that is not a component of the nuclear negotiations, and they should not be subjected to sanctions or limitations there. And we, that may have been the test, to sort of measure the U.S.'s response following their own missile test. And of course, the U.S. had to respond and show, look, we are serious about these restrictions. They had to delay it for the political reason of getting the prisoner swap to follow through. But it does raise the question of moving forward. We're entering an election cycle in Iran where, more hardliner campaigners are going to be asserting the military rights and defenses of Iran. The military program is a big part of that, the missile program. So further tests and then further responses required by the U.S. will add tension to the nuclear deal. I don't think it's going to undermine it completely, but it does raise an important question, I think, moving forward into this implementation phase.
And that military tension really is a big part of this. And there's been a lot made of this $100 billion that will be released to Iran after this lifting of the sanctions. How will that money be used?
Well, Iran has a lot of financial requirements right now, and I think first and foremost, it's about reviving its energy sector, and Iran needs at least $100 billion to revive production in a lot of the fields that have been shut in, and Iran has thrown out a lot of estimates of, how much it can increase production instantaneously now with the lifting of sanctions, but the reality is quite different. It needs significant investment, and that's why we're going to see a lot of foreign visits to and from Iran, business deals being signed. So I think really the energy sector is going to be a big priority there. And then, of course, Iran has huge, priorities overall economically, with oil prices now sinking so low and Iran contributing to that. They need to make sure that social programs are maintained. They're going to have to cut spending in a lot of areas. And I know the fallback position of many people is that, well, with all this money now, Iran is going to be able to amplify, its aggression in the region through its covert programs and things like that. I think that's a bit exaggerated. Of course, extra money is going to help Iran's defenses and its military programs, its covert programs. It's expending a lot of resources in places like Syria. But I don't think you're going to see a dramatic shift altogether. Iran is already heavily invested there. This certainly gives them a little bit more room to maneuver, but there are other huge financial challenges that they need to overcome. And again, that comes back to reviving the energy sector.
When the U.S. hasn't lifted its embargo on Iran, so where will this investment come from that you're talking about that's needed?
That's an important point. And the idea here is that while the European Union has formally lifted sanctions, the same does not go for the United States. And that's a result of, the very intricate web of sanctions that are encoded in U.S. legislation. Essentially, that's very, very hard to unravel if you don't have the political consensus to do so. So what we have in effect is the U.S. administration suspending sanctions in the sense that you're not going to see the U.S. punish countries and companies for buying oil from Iran, doing business with Iran. Those are the so-called secondary sanctions. Formally lifting sanctions by the U.S. is going to be a whole other picture. The Iran Sanctions Act, which is really the bedrock of the Iran sanctions web, that is due to sunset actually at the end of this year. I don't think the political climate is conducive to allowing it to sunset. Essentially that means U.S. energy investors are not going to get into Iran. We're watching for room for, whether U.S. subsidiaries are going to be able to engage with Iran on an economic level. That's something that the Treasury Department has to clarify. But the majority of investment is going to be coming from the Europeans, the Chinese, the Indians are showing a ton of interest, and that's primarily where Iran is going to be looking.
And there's also this huge fear that we already have an oversupplied oil market with really low oil prices, and we add more Iranian oil onto the markets and prices fall even further. What political impact is that going to have for the country?
Well, not even just for the country, even beyond Iran, right? So Iran is already coping with lower oil prices, but it needs to maximize revenue as best as it can. So Iran is going to sell as much as it possibly can. It has maybe around 25 million barrels in storage. It can, add another 500,000 of barrels in production now with the easing of sanctions, but beyond that, it's going to take them a while to add more. But the real key thing here is now that we're in the 20s now with the price of oil, what does that mean for Saudi and the Gulf states? And everything that we can assess so far is that they are digging their heels in and, getting prepared to ride out this phase of very low oil prices. And they're doing the spending cuts, cutting subsidies in some places, talking about other moves possibly to float shares of even Saudi Aramco to raise money. And all of this points to no signs of really a dramatic or sudden cut in output by OPEC. Saudi's not going to get the coordination it needs to do that. And secondly, I think they are preparing to raise their debt levels and just sort of ride this out. But that still carries huge implications for those crisis countries like Venezuela, of course. Russia is under huge financial stress. They're trying to impose a 10% cut to their budget across the board, which is very politicized. And a number of countries across the board that are, of course, going to be struggling in this low oil price environment, which is here to stay for some time.
Thank you. It's a complicated picture, a lot of moving parts, it seems like.
Thank you.
For more on this and other topics, please visit stratfor.com.